Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tina. I am the Capability Building Coordinator for Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar, How to Pitch with Impact, which will be presented by Tom Hull from the Funding Network. We'll start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any questions during the session, please type it into the questions box on your webinar panel, and Tom will answer them at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. Please note that your comments and questions will not appear to the entire group. If you have any technical issues, please also type it into this questions box and I'll be able to help you out through there as well. Please note that if you are on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. If possible, please close all other programs to help you have the best experience possible today. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that the webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you all within 2 business days after the webinar ends, along with the slides. That's all from me for now. I hand it over to Tom to get things started. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tina. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us for the session on how to pitch with impact. I am running the video, so I hope that you guys can see me. As well as hear me. I'm sure you'll let Tina know if there are any technical glitches, but we'll get straight into it. One of the things that I'm going to talk about today is how when you're pitching, it's essential that you create as close a connection to your audience so that they know you and you know them. And one of the odd things about delivering webinars, of course, is that I have no idea who you are. And most of you would never have met me before, but as a way to try and bridge that gap, I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself first. So this is me. I'm 43 years old. I have a 4-year-old son. I spent 15 years working in the advertising and communications marketing world before I left that career and retrained through the Centre for Social Impact. And I've been the general manager of the Funding Network for the last 4.5 years. So that's who I am, and I thought I would start with a quick poll just to get an idea of, obviously I don't know who you all are personally, but who has heard of the Funding Network? I thought I would ask Tina to send out a poll. Let me know if you have ever heard of the Funding Network before this session. So you must be pressing your buttons or giving your indication. I'm sure Tina will tell me in a minute what the answers are. The reason I was going to ask about that is obviously at the end of this session, I will tell you a little bit more about how you might be able to connect with us, whether you're a non-profit who's interested in pitching at our events or whether you're interested in doing some further pitch coaching. But it's always useful from my point of view just to tell whether people that we're speaking out to out there have heard of the work we do at the Funding Network. So I'll wait for that poll to continue. One of the things that we stress at the Funding Network is about how our pitching and our pitch coaching is not teaching or training. This isn't about trying to create cookie cutter versions of the best and most perfect pitch out there. And I hate to tell you that there is no magic silver bullet when it comes to knowing how to pitch with confidence and pitch clearly, because so much of great pitching is about personal authenticity. It's about being connected to who you are and what you believe in. And of course, everyone is different and every program is different and everyone's relationship and story and reasons for working in the sector are different. So a lot of what we'll talk today is about how you can make yourself the best person you can be in your pitches, rather than giving you an exact structure for how every perfect pitch gets done. However, I will focus a little bit today on structure and tools. I'll do a little bit of theory up front. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the theory of communications, but there is some context to that, which is always helpful, I think. What I really want you to go away with today are some genuine tools and tips that you can actually implement and use in your day-to-day work, or when it comes to pitching. Really, there are 3 things that are important in pitching. One is to know your material, one is to know your audience, and one is to know yourself. and we'll go through those with those three as we go through this session. Now, I haven't had the answers back from that poll, so I'll wait for Tina to come back to me.
Yep. So we've got the answers now. 42% have said that they have heard of the funding network, and 58% have said they have not.
All right, that's about familiar, but my marketing team would be pretty pleased, I think, to hear that nearly half of you have heard of TFN. So I'm not going to do a big sell job on us now. I'll talk a little bit more about us again at the end. But for those of you who don't know the funding network, we're set up really to try and create greater community connections between donors, philanthropists, and grassroots social change organizations in order to increase the flow of capital, support, and resources to the grassroots innovation in Australia. And we do this mostly through live crowdfunding events where small charities pitch live on stage to large audiences. So that's essentially what we do. We've been doing this for the last 4 years, and we've run over 50 or 60 of these events. We have pitch coaches all around the country that prepare people for these events. And I do need to thank the two people that have built the content of what I'm about to go through today are Lisa Cotton, the founder of the Funding Network in Australia, and Rob Irving, our head pitch coach. Both of those have put together this syllabus, and it's delivered by a range of different professional coaches around the country. So thanks to those two. All right, we'll come back to TFN a bit later. So let's jump straight into it. So at the Funding Network, we build our methodology of our pitch coaching methodology around what we call the 5 Ps. So those are passion, purpose, planning, practice, and performance. Now, that's fairly simple to use a sort of acronym like that to put some context around a coaching methodology. But really, if you can make sure that anytime you're putting a pitch together, and when we mean pitch, we don't really mean necessarily standing live on stage in front of 100 people. This is any conversation, really. Any time that you get a chance to talk to your staff in large numbers, any time you go to talk to a funder, whether it's across the table or whether it's to a group of funders at a boardroom lunch, being able to pitch with clarity and with impact will have as much influence, hopefully, on the way that you write your grant applications, the way that you do the copy for your website, the way that you have conversations with your funders. It's not just about public performance. But if you think about these 5 Ps in turn, then if you can tick them off and get to the end and think about making sure that you're well practiced, then it should put you in the best position possible to be able to have any funding conversation or public pitch. So the first is passion. Now, what do we mean by passion? So passion really is now grounded in neuroscience. There are 2 quite famous quotes that I'm sure you've heard before. They're well used in our sector. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, and people fund people, not programs. Now, culture eats strategies for breakfast is wrongly attributed to the famous American strategist, Peter Drucker. But both of these statements bring to life the insight in this section about passion and the neuroscience of persuasion, which is that there's an ancient philosophical debate, really, which was most famously between David Hume and Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, which is the real driver of human behavior, which is the greatest influence on human behavior and human action. Is it emotion or is it rationality? Is it your head or your heart, to put it in a simple way? And this debate went on for a while as a philosophical debate. Eventually, it became a psychological topic, and now it's really a neuroscientific topic. And we know the answer. You would all know that emotion is really what drives people's behavior and people's action. Now, rationality can help you come to a decision or come to a conclusion, but what motivates people into action is emotion. Now, there's an interesting piece of research performed by the Harvard Business Review, where they evaluated 150 hours of the most popular TED Talks against Aristotle's ancient formula for storytelling and plotted it against these three areas. So ethos, logos, and pathos. You may have heard of these before. So they're the three elements of storytelling that Aristotle formulated. Ethos is about establishing your own credibility as a speaker. Logos is about the facts and the data, the left brain side, the evidence of what it is that you're putting forward in your story or in your pitch. And pathos is the emotion and storytelling. So it's how you bring to life the connection that you create with the audience through the stories that you tell about yourself or about other people. And in evaluating that 150 hours of the most watched TED Talks, Harvard Business Review came up with that 65% of the time is spent by those speakers, those people who are giving those TED Talks, on emotion and storytelling. And only 25% on the evidence, on the data, and only 10% on credibility. So just goes to show how important storytelling and an emotion is, even when you're trying to convince people of an argument. In the TED case, convincing people your idea is worth spreading. It just goes to show how important emotion is in any pitch. And emotion is what will connect people to your sense of passion. So storytelling and your body language are the things which are most likely to communicate emotion to your listeners and to convey your sense of passion for your topic. Another question that often gets asked in this section around the theory of neuroscience of persuasion is how much of communication is nonverbal. And again, you've probably heard this before. There were several studies have been done since the 1970s, and I have to say some of these come with a little bit of a caveat because any piece of research is obviously done in a bubble. But most people reckon that whether you believe in Albert Mehrabian's research or not, that probably more than 50% of your ability to influence other people is body language and nonverbal. So, and only a relatively small minority of what it is that you are able to convince people with is actually the content. So the tone of voice that you adopt and the body language that you portray and is a much greater influence on how people will perceive and whether they'll believe what you've got to say and whether they'll believe in you than actually what you say. So the combination of these two bits of information, that emotion is the key driver for human behavior and human action. If you want to get someone to act on what you're saying, then you need to bring them on board with a sense of, you need them to go on an emotional journey. And emotion is conveyed mostly through storytelling, as we saw in the Harvard Business Review example, and body language, as you can see in this non-verbal communication. So the summary of this theoretical section around passion is that you convey your passion to your audience by your body language, your tone of voice, and how you tell stories. Now, I'm not saying that data and evidence and content isn't important. Of course it is. And that often is what will tip people over the line. Sometimes it's what certain types of people will be basing their evaluation of what you've got to say on, but you're not going to be able to get people over the line and into a situation where they're likely to act on what you want to say, unless you're able to connect with them through your body language, your story, and your storytelling, and therefore connect with them on an emotional level. Now, connecting on an emotional level isn't just about what you do when you sit down with that person for conversation or when you jump up to the stage to give your pitch. Connecting emotionally with people and bringing people on the journey with you happens from the very first moment that you meet them. That statement around you never get a second chance to make a first impression is all about body language. So whenever you're thinking about when you're preparing for a pitch, public pitch or a private pitch to an individual, here are some other things that you must think about, which are really nothing to do so much with the content, but are more to do with the impression that you're going to create. Every previous interaction that you've had with the person that you're saying, the funder or the group of people that are in the room, is going to have an influence on how they've connected with you emotionally. So from the moment that you are having your first meeting or first phone call or first email with someone who may go on to be a funder, you need to think about the language you're using and what kind of an emotional connection you're creating with them for what may end up being quite a long journey before you get to the point that you make an ask of them. Your energy, body language, what is it that you're giving off when you walk into a room? What you wear, using people's first name. Whenever you can, do try and remember people's first names as soon as you meet them, and you use it a number of times when you first meet them, particularly if you think you're going to go on to be making an ask of them. Your body language, as we've talked about, your eye contact is essential. When you're in a large room of people, often people are told to sort of wash their eye over the room and try and connect with as many random eyes as possible. I disagree with that. I think you're better off actually trying to create a closer connection with fewer people. So as you look out into a room that you're pitching to, whether that's a boardroom or whether it's a theatre, hold people's eyes for 3 or 4 seconds and move from person to person and try and create a connection through your contact with them. Don't just wash over the room in a general sense. Your opening remark, we'll come back to talking about your opening remark when we talk about the structure of a pitch, but the first thing you say and the last thing you say are likely to be the two things that people will remember. Of any pitch, they're going to remember maybe 20% of it if you're lucky. And the first thing you say and the last thing you say are the things that are most likely to stay with them. So make sure that those are the things that count. Think about who you pitch with. So not every pitch is done alone. And in fact, we see a lot of very successful pitches where people either bring beneficiaries along to tell stories with them, or maybe they bring board members, or maybe you can think about program managers. Pitching isn't always an individual sport. It can be done together, and it can be very powerful when two people's points of view or stories or backgrounds can be combined into a particular pitch. The stories you tell, we'll come back to that. Any organization that pitches for money needs to be able to draw on stories that illustrate different points about the work that your organization does and the people that you benefit. How you close, I've talked about, so your closing remark. And then your own personal why. So I mentioned at the beginning that you need to be able to make sure that you know your content, that you know your audience, and you know yourself. So knowing your own personal reason for doing what you do and working where you work and being connected to that personal purpose is essential to any powerful pitch. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about now. So that first session was about passion. And if you remember, the summary of that is that passion comes through in creating an emotional connection with people, that emotion is what's going to drive people's behavior and action in any pitch, so getting them to actually do something at the end. And that's going to be mostly delivered through your ability to tell stories that bring that emotional connection to life, and your body language. Second part, purpose, know your why. So the great thing about the sector that we all work in, and I'm assuming that most of the people on this webinar are social entrepreneurs or fundraisers or work in the social sector in some capacity. I mean, I think a lot of entrepreneurs also feel a similar purpose for what they do, but particularly in our sector, there is it's easier to connect with a higher purpose about the reasons that we do what we do. But it's not always your own story. Quite often, the people that we work with at the grassroots have established a social enterprise or a charity because of a personal association with a particular issue, or they've had lived experience, or a family member has. But it's not always the case. But what's really important to be able to do is connect with why it is that you do what you do, and being able to articulate that to people, so that they feel that you are driven by a higher purpose and you're really in touch with the reasons why you do your job. So I'm sure, again, another reference that is a very well watched TEDx video in this case, Simon Sinek. He's famous for his video about how leaders inspire action. I would encourage you to jump on Google and search for Simon Sinek, how great leaders inspire action. But his big mantra is, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And he uses in that video the example of Apple, which when he did the video was still in its ascendance. And I think everyone knows now that Apple has created a connection with their consumers around the world that few other brands have. But his argument is that Apple doesn't sell computers or phones or technology equipment. It sells a vision. It sells a vision, in that case, to sort of democratize technology and to put great technology in the hands of everybody. And this is the same for when you're pitching. People are less likely to be persuaded. I mean, of course, people will evaluate you on your programs and on the evidence of your programs, but they will buy into you because you can convey the passion that we've just talked about and that you're deeply connected to the reasons that you do what you do. Being able to tell a personal story about how you ended up where you are, what were the decisions that brought you to do what you do, how is it that you've been chosen to do the pitch, and why is it that you're asking for this money? And to be able to connect with that in an authentic and real way is essential to creating connection with your audience, but also it's a bedrock a lot of the sense of confidence. If you really believe that the pitch you're giving and the reason you do what you do is valid and is powerful and is motivating to you, then other people will believe it too, and you won't be nervous about standing up and pitching to them about the programs you deliver and the money that you need to continue. So that second section is all about purpose. Please watch the Simon Sinek video, and that will help you start to think about if you're not already familiar with being able to articulate to people why you do what you do, then that will help you get there. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So, third section, planning. So this is where we're going to start to get into a little bit more of the practical side of things. Just going to check how we're doing on time here. It's okay. But first a little bit on how communications works. So most people fall into the usual trap of taking the 5 elements of any piece of communication, which is the sender, the message, the medium, the receiver, and the response. So any piece of communication has these 5 elements. There's someone who's sending the message, there's the message itself, the content, there's the medium, which is the channel that you're using to deliver the message, there's the person who's receiving it, and there's the response that you want from that person. And most people, when they're thinking about any pitch or any funding proposal, start with this familiar statement. Oh shit, I have a pitch next week. What am I going to say? Oh shit, I have a pitch next week. What am I going to say? And then people open up PowerPoint or open up Word on an empty page and go, right, start writing. What am I going to say? And this is such a familiar trap to fall into, and one that no wonder it scares people, because you're starting blank without even thinking about what it is that you want to achieve. And if anybody has spent any time working with an advertising agency, or any time thinking about putting a marketing communications campaign together, they would know that the first thing you've got to ask yourself is, well, what are you trying to achieve? So don't think about it from the sender down, but think about it from the response up. Take yourself out of the equation. Don't put I and what you need to say as the priority. Put what you want to achieve and who it is that you're talking to as the priority. So again, it's another one of those great tricks that because it takes you out of the picture, it can remove a lot of that nervousness and lack of confidence that you have about knowing what to say. You start by focusing on what response do I want from the people who I'm talking to, and who it is exactly that I'm going to talk to. The more that you can find out about your audience, insights into them and what their motivations are, the more likely you are to be able to write a good pitch for them and to get the response that you want. In fact, we often find that when you start in reverse and think about, well, what am I trying to achieve with this particular pitch or this particular conversation, and who is it that I'm talking to and what do I know about them? Often you'll work your way back up that list and you'll go, well, maybe the medium is wrong. Maybe I shouldn't be going to have coffee with them. Maybe a letter would actually be better as a starting point. Or maybe I shouldn't be pitching at the next board meeting of this foundation. Maybe I should be meeting up with the chair to take them through our work. And you may even decide, I mean, you certainly will decide how to craft your message, but quite often you end up going, well, actually, am I the right person? Maybe in this situation, now that I know a good deal more about what response I'm trying to get at the end of this meeting or this pitch, and I know much more about the person I'm going to pitch to, maybe it's not me. Maybe it's someone on my board that actually knows someone at their organization, or maybe it should be one of our program managers, or maybe it should be a program manager or one of our beneficiaries that goes along to talk to these people. So reversing this, flipping this, the familiar approach, which is, oh shit, I have a presentation next week, what am I going to say? And instead thinking about what response you want and who you're going to talk to often will help you frame what you're going to say and even who it is that you're going to send to do the pitch. So when you're then moving into this idea of planning for your pitch and thinking about who it is that you're going to talk to, there's an art to managing people's responses. That first thing you want to work out is what kind of response do you want from them. And these are many and varied. Not every ask, as you would know, is about money. Quite often you ask people to come on a journey with you as a supporter of some sort. Maybe you're trying to get someone to join your board. Maybe you're trying to get a volunteering relationship with them. Maybe it's a corporate sponsorship. All sorts of different responses that you can want. Maybe it's just getting them to agree to come to your location and see your programs, or to agree to a second meeting. But the things that you need to think about in managing any kind of response are, there are four ways in which people respond to what you've got to say and the pitch that you give. There's going to be the things they notice, which is about their sensory response to your body language. There's going to be the things that they think, which are going to be how they react to what you say, so the rational side, the left brain stuff. There's going to be how they feel, which is their emotional reaction to, again, stories, your body language, and the way that you connect with them on a psychological level. And then there's going to be their response, in their active response. So what is they going to do, which is going to be in response to your call to action or your ask. What are you actually getting them to do at that point? Is it to agree to come to another meeting, or is it to sign a check? And to go back to what we talked about before with passion and the influence of body language and the influence of emotion, of these four elements, the elements that have the greatest influence on success are what they notice in your body language and how they feel about the stories that you tell. And then the bedrock to those is how they think rationally about the case that you put forward, and then what it is that they're going to do, how they're going to act in response to the call to action or the ask that you put in front of them. So the art of response management, think about those four things in every pitch you're putting together. What are they going to notice? What are they going to think? What are they going to feel? And what are they going to do? So now on to the very practical side of planning your pitch, which we call mapping. So at the Funding Network, we have put together a map. Again, this is not stuff that you probably would never have seen before. This kind of structure to any piece of communication is not rocket science, and nor is it intended to be something that everybody should go out there and use, as I say, a kind of cookie cutter. But what it hopefully will do is give you a bit of a structure into which you can plot elements of your value proposition and elements of your pitch, and then you can pepper the structure itself with stories that are particular to your organization. So it's a 5-step map that we use when we're working with on our pitch coaching sessions for all the people that pitch at our events. And it breaks down into context, implications, solution, impact, and then the call to action or the ask. So I'd like to go through each one of these in turn and just give you an idea of what goes into each section, bearing in mind the two pieces we've talked about so far, about conveying your passion through your body language and your stories and your purpose. So context, what do we mean by context? This is the part of the pitch in which you would describe the overall situation. what's going on a global or a national or a very broad level that can bring to life what the overall problem is. The broad issue, this is the problem or the issue that you feel compelled to solve at your organization, or that the program that you're going to pitch is solving. And this is the point where you want to bring to life credible sources of data. It's also an opportunity to grab your audience at the very beginning of your pitch. There are so many sort of rhetorical, familiar ways for people to open up pitches, either thanking their audience, or thanking particular people, or introducing themselves, or saying, thank you for having me. Our belief is that you should hit your audience between the eyes with something that's compelling from the moment that you open your mouth. Obviously, this is about somewhat to do with performance pitching, but even when you're talking to someone in a more intimate environment, it's important to grab their attention from the outset with something that is setting the context. It doesn't have to be doesn't have to have shock value, but important facts that they might not know about the situation that you work in. Sometimes it's a story, sometimes it can be a quote or a testimonial. These are the things that are going to ensure that, as I referred to before, the first thing that you say is something that your audience is going to remember. And this is an opportunity to give them the big picture. First, context. The next piece is when we're getting down a little bit more specific. So what are the implications of that contextual information that you've just given your audience? So what does it actually mean, that macro situation? What does it actually mean for an individual or for a particular community that you're helping? Can you bring to life what life is really like for them? And again, this is another opportunity to use a story about a beneficiary of your programs, or someone who's come through the program. And in this implications area, always refer to real places or people. I mean, by all means, change people's names to protect the innocent, but bring this to life for your audience, and try and place them in it if you can. Personify what the real human consequences are for that macro issue that you've been able to talk about, and bring it down to the reality of day-to-day life for the people that you're helping. A way of sort of placing the audience in the picture, if you can, is to say to them, well, imagine what it would be like if you. So, imagine what it would be like if you couldn't sign your own name, if you're talking about a literacy program, or enabling them to somehow go from the very macro situation and the overall broad problem you just described, right down to trying to internalize for themselves, what might this actually be like for them if they were in this situation, or what is it like for someone who is in this particular situation. So that's the implication. So we've gone from a very broad and quite high impact description of the issue you're working on, down into what the specific issues are day to day, and perhaps a story about someone who is suffering in the situation that you're trying to help. So the third bit is solution. So pretty obviously, this is where you get to describe your organization, your program, your business, and to do that in detail. This is where you talk about things like current supporters, how your business model works, what your relationship with your beneficiaries are, whether you're a volunteer-run organization, exactly how your programs work, whether it's based on evidence from programs in other countries, other states, or what evidence you've already got of success for this particular program from programs you've delivered in the past. To talk about who the people are involved, whether that's the CEO and team if you're a small organization, or whether it's the actual program managers and volunteers that are delivering the programs if you're a large organization. And this, of course, is the chance to put on the table testimonials and endorsements from ideally beneficiaries or customers or clients, but also from third parties, other founders and other funders, other corporate partners. This is really where you build the case for your solution, exactly how it works, exactly how the program works, and go into detail about that side of things. So third part of the solution. Excuse me. Fourth is impact. So what exactly is your program going to achieve, or what are your ambitions? What do you, and this can be short-term or long-term, depending on the program. Is this, what are the outcomes going to be for this particular program, or what is it your organization is trying to achieve in the long term? Depending on the conversation you're having, one or other of those will be more appropriate. Increasingly now, of course, funders in any situation, even if you've only got a limited amount of time to pitch them, they do want to hear that you are at least intending to measure outcomes and measure impact, and that you have a focus on data collection, analysis, that there is a feedback loop to yourself for continual learning and improvement, and also a feedback loop to them if they're a funder. This is when it's the time to talk about what the timelines and project plan are around how you're going to implement the program and when you're intending to see the outcomes that you've outlined. And get really granular and detailed in this section around what it is that you're achieving. Impact also can be previous impact. So if you haven't already covered this in the solutions section, then you can talk here about any formal or informal impact evaluation that you've had in place previously, and the evidence of that impact. So that's the fourth part, is impact. And then finally, pretty obviously, is the call to action or the ask. So at our events, people have 6 minutes to pitch on stage, and we always say that you need to leave at least the last minute for your ask, your call to action. And that's true for any conversation, really. You need to leave enough time to be able to table what it is that you want the person you're talking to do. And as you would all be familiar with, this is probably the part that most people are most uncomfortable with when it comes to pitching, is actually asking for the money, or asking for whatever it is that how it is that you're hoping the audience are going to contribute. But it's essential to be clear and confident and emphatic at this point. There's no point in having gone through all of that information, storytelling, emotional connection, evidence base, if you're not going to get to the point. So many times you hear people pitch and then there just is no ask at the end, and the audience are often left with, well, what am I meant to do next? How am I going to act to support you? How can I take action? By the time you get to this point, if you've followed the process so far and you're clear about your passion and your why, and you're clear about your programs and your content, then having the confidence to ask at this point shouldn't be difficult. If you know your audience, then being able to place your ask correctly for how it is that they're able to contribute, it should also not be difficult. One of the things that we always recommend is break the ask down into chunks, as well as having an overall goal. So give them an idea of what you're trying to achieve as a whole with the program, or as a whole as an organization, if you're talking about operational funding. But then break that down into what can smaller amounts of funding do for you, or how is it that this particular funder may be able to have an influence at a scale that is appropriate for them. And you need to be able to put something in front of them that gives them something that they can associate their own funding with now, but also a sense of where the big goal is. Of course, when do you want them to act? How can they take action? Are you hoping that they're just going to jump on your website, or is this something that you want to be able to come back to them for a conversation in the future? But do not leave them in two minds about what it is you want them to do next. By this point, if you've been through this process and your pitch has covered off what we talked about so far, they absolutely will be primed to hear how it is that they can help, and what it is that they can do. So to emphasize again, be clear, be strong, be emphatic. So that's the map that we use. I'll just go back to it for a second so you can have a look, and you will get this deck following this. So that's the map: context, implications, solution, impact, and the call to action. And depending on the length of your pitch, you can work out how much time is spent on each of those sections. But as I said, with the short pitches that we coach people for in front of live audiences, always make sure that you leave at least 60 seconds for the call to action and the ask. So now that's the mapping. A quick word on the role of storytelling. So we talked a bit about how storytelling is the key to creating emotional connection with audience. We looked at that Harvard Business Review piece of research. This is a well-known Steve Jobs quote about storytellers really being the people who set the agenda for a generation to come. And it's so true, because we are not set up really to digest information through data, bullet points, PowerPoint. We as humans are set up to retain information that is put to us through stories. So if you can take the information that you've got, whether it's evidence-based, whether it's data, whether it's testimonials, and turn these into real stories about real people, and embed in those stories the evidence of what it is you're going to achieve and the ambitions of your organization, then those stories are far more likely to stay with your audience than putting up a series of bullet points or a data visualization on a screen. So story can play a role in any pitch at any time, really. In many ways, your pitch as a whole is one narrative, and that framework I've just taken you through should help you put some kind of a narrative arc through the pitch as a whole. But particular stories about beneficiaries or about your founder or about your organization can play a part in really any of those sections. I've seen people start with a story about a beneficiary. Quite often it plays a role in the implications section when you're talking about what life is really like for the people you're helping. Sometimes it's about impact when you're talking about someone who's been through the program, and now it's the positive story about where they are now and how they've benefited. But ensuring that you have a sort of briefcase or a library of stories about your organization and the work that you're doing that you can call on at any point and you can insert into any pitch or any conversation is essential. People often talk about storytelling now as being an essential component for leadership. Leaders of the biggest companies are coaching themselves how to tell stories, because it's really only through storytelling that you can infuse and inspire people to work for you, and it's no different with funders. So stories. Again, most of you probably would have seen this sort of academic breakdown of storytelling. So every story is pretty much made up of the same similar structure. So when you come to think about putting a story together, other than the kind of beginning, middle, and end, then just think about these four sections. So there's always a protagonist, there's always a person or an organization who is the hero or villain in the story. There's always a challenge that hero or villain has to face. And there's a transformation, a change that protagonist goes through, and then there's a resolution. So even if you're only telling a 30-second story about someone, trying to think about it in that structure, because it helps people grab a hold of the concept and the story that you're talking through, and it also makes sure that you're pretty good and pretty succinct in putting your stories together. So does it have a beginning, a middle, and end? Is there a protagonist? What's the challenge and the transformation they go through? And what's the resolution? What's the point? What's the point of the story? I've included in this pack a little bit of a slide that might help you put some stories together that uses those elements, challenge, character traits of the protagonist, the journey that they're on, which is often the transformation, the resolution, and then the impact, which is the final, what's the point of the story. So you can perhaps use that as part of this pack. Right, we're getting towards the back end now, so we're now really into the practical side. So we've talked about passion and purpose, and we've talked about mapping your pitch. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about practice, because you can never be over-prepared for any pitch and any conversation. In fact, most people spend a lot of time on their content, on writing what it is they want to say. And for even those people who are excellent at researching their audience and knowing exactly what it is they want to get from their audience, and people who are highly connected to their own personal passions and their why, still don't spend enough time on practice. You need to know your material upside down and backwards. the best actors in the world only get to the point where they can ad-lib their lines once they know the actual lines inside out. The sense of confidence that comes with being familiar with your material is what allows you to overcome nerves. If you know your material, and you'd know this from if you go to hear anyone who's given a speech that they've given hundreds of times before, you can just see a sense of confidence in what are they going to say, because they're not thinking about what it is that they need to say. They know it. So you can never be over prepared. Familiarity and confidence allows you to relax and ad lib and to tell better stories, and also to react to your audience and to answer questions better. When it comes to practice, do everything you can. So practice in the mirror, practice to your dog if you need to. Video yourself on your phone. Even if you're only trying to practice how it is that you're going to deliver a particular ask to a funder when you go to meet them, or how it is that you're going to describe a particular program or tell a particular story, video yourself telling that story and then watch it back. It's painful, but it's a brilliant way to critique yourself and work out where your own personal glitches or where you stumble or where you think you need to put additional emphasis. Another great tip is once you've written your pitch, and I do suggest whenever you have a important story to tell or an important pitch to give, do write it out in full first, and learn it by heart, then bullet point it onto reminder cards if you need to. And a great thing that I find is if you actually record it, audio record it on your phone and listen to it at night, particularly just before you go to sleep, your brain's ability to retain information and to put it back into the subconscious just before you go to sleep, and oddly enough, just as soon as you wake up, is remarkable. So record it on your phone, put those headphones on, and then just before you go to sleep, listen to yourself giving your own pitch. It'll really help you with memorizing it. So there's some tips on practice. The last piece, which is closely connected to practice, is performance. How are we doing for time? 11:47. Okay. So performance. A lot of people can get the rest of what we've talked about absolutely right, but then their biggest fear is the actual performance itself. And getting up in public, or standing up in front of your staff, or even actually having that conversation with a funder when there's a lot on the line. And all of these are performance in one form or another. The trick is that if you know your material and you know your audience and you know yourself and you know your reasons for doing it, then really the performance piece is the easy piece, and in many ways should be the bit that you enjoy most. And in the bit, certainly over time, as you become more familiar with public presenting and pitching, will certainly become be the bit that you take most pleasure in. But I know that's not the case for everybody. As you're working towards that, here are a few tips to think about when it comes to performance. Opening and closing, we've mentioned this before, so it's highly likely that the things that your audience will most remember are the way you opened and the way that you closed. What was it that you grabbed their attention with as the first statement? What was that story or that piece of data or that quote that you first opened up with? And similarly with closing, how did you leave them? What was it that you left them with as a call to action? Second is posture. I'll come back to that in a second, but how you stand and your body language is essential to your performance and the perception of your performance. Once you've written your pitch, go through it all again and change as many of the U's as you possibly, many of the I's as you can to use. In what you say, try and make sure that you're referring to your audience more often than you are referring to yourself. I talked a bit about deep and sustained eye contact. So choose few people in the audience, but fewer people in the audience, but hold their gaze for longer. Smile with your eyes is a great thing that an anchor TV news person told me once, is that you can actually convey a sense that you're smiling through just the way that you look at people. So think about when you're looking at people in the audience that you don't need to be giving a big grin, but smile at them with your eyes. Repetition is a great way to create confidence in your audience, in that you know what you're talking about. So if there are particular points in your pitch, don't be afraid to repeat them. Repetition actually It doesn't bore, it actually creates a greater sense of confidence and actually relaxes your audience. Question, pause, answer, and look, breathe, move. Both of these are techniques that you can use. So if you're on stage, you can often ask a rhetorical question of the audience, pause, and then deliver the answer yourself. And if you want to take it to the next level, then you can use the technique of look at the audience, take a breath, move across the stage, and then answer. Rhetorical technique. Don't stand behind a lectern if you can possibly avoid it. So get out from behind the lectern. It's a barrier to engagement with your audience. Anytime that you are pitching, I really would advise you to, well, to start with, not using a microphone at all. Project your voice as if you were in you're in a Roman Colosseum, is the example I use. But if you do have to use a microphone, then use a lapel or an earphone mic so that you have your hands free to express yourself, and that you can also walk about the stage. Maybe even get down into the audience and touch them and be close to them and look closer in the eye. It's much more likely to create an emotional connection than if you stand behind a lectern. Ditch your notes. So I talked about when you're writing up a formal pitch, write it out in full, then bullet point it, and then and in the process learn it, and then get rid of the notes altogether. You will be a much more accomplished and powerful presenter if you're able to present without notes. Please don't use PowerPoint unless you absolutely have to. And if you do use PowerPoint, don't write on the screen what it is that you're saying. So don't just put bullet points up on the screen that's a repeat of what it is you're saying, like I am here. Unfortunately, it's kind of unavoidable with a webinar. But use high impact video or high impact photography or imagery or data visualization if you need to. But PowerPoint, I mean, there's been numerous studies done that suggest that if you just repeat on screen the words that you're saying, no one remembers anything. They don't remember what you say, and they don't remember what was on the screen either. It's much better to use your PowerPoint as what it was originally designed for, as a visual aid. It's meant to be there to help create greater emphasis and impact for what it is you're saying, not to repeat what it is that you're telling the audience. Finally, nerves. Everyone always asks me about nerves. How do I deal with my nerves? Well, frankly, the best thing is to know your material. If you know your material, know your audience, you believe in yourself and your passion, then nerves are something that over time are very easy to deal with. But there is a neat trick, and I am thankful to Shelley Lazaret for giving me this trick. She's one of our pitch coaches. It's called the Wonder Woman pose, or the superhero pose. It is scientifically proven that if you stand upright with your hands on your hips, push out your chest, hold your head high, and stand in what in yogic terms is called mountain pose, then this will drive up your testosterone levels and drive down your cortisol levels, which are the hormones that are the counteraction to nerve and the creation of cortisol. The testosterone and cortisol are both an enormous influence on how nervous you feel. And if before you go out to step on stage, or before you go to any public presentation, if you just take a few minutes to stand in the superhero pose, it is scientifically proven to help you deal with your nerves and to help you put a sense of confidence and power into your body language and into your head. So it's just a neat trick to think about, of all the different ways in which people deal with their nerves. This might be one that you like to think about. Right, so at the end of the most of the session there, the only thing I wanted to finish off with before we go to question time, and I think we've probably got about 5 minutes for questions, is that really what I've gone through today is a very quick summary of what we go through in the TFN pitch coaching workshops. We do offer these pitch coaching workshops to organizations and individuals. So for organizations, we run half-day workshops for up to 5 pairs, and we do encourage people to come in pairs so that the action learning is actually the learning experience is enhanced when you've got 2 people working together on a pitch, which for an organization for 5 people is $5,000 for a half-day workshop, or $10,000 for a full-day workshop for up to 10 pairs. And that can be a mixture of organizations, or it can be one organization. And we also run open half-day workshops for $1,000 per pair. Now, all of this information is available via our website. So you can jump on there, find out a little bit more about TFN and the workshops that we put on, and you can get in contact with us to ask when the next workshop in your city is. We currently run them in Sydney and Melbourne, or you can get in contact with us to find out if your organisation would be interested in a pitch coaching workshop for your team. I think the best point now is for me to hand back to Tina and see if any of you in the last 5 minutes have got any questions. Happy to answer.
Yep, we've got a few questions that have come through. So the first one is, in a pitch presentation, is it okay to read off a card if it's somebody else's words? I read a story written by the mother of a young man who committed suicide. The rest of it is all off the cuff, live.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think that's fine. In a funny kind of way, from a performance perspective, doing that makes it look like you're sort of, I'm reading from it, here's a letter that someone else had written for me. So you're giving yourself permission to actually use it as a prop and a bit of theatre to emphasise the fact that these aren't your words. This is a genuine, true story written by someone else. So I think in that situation, you may even know the story off by heart, but you could use that as a prop and a bit of theatre, which brings to life the fact that this is a real story. So by all means, I think another good way to emphasize that kind of thing when you're telling someone else's story is to have a picture of them. If you've got a photo of the person you're telling the story about up on screen whilst you tell their story, then that can obviously help with your audience's emotional engagement with the protagonist.
Okay, the next one is, when you say don't use PowerPoint, what if you must use video or photo? Or do you mean no visuals at all?
No, videos and photos, absolutely. Definitely use PowerPoint. I mean, PowerPoint is just a tool, right? And PowerPoint is brilliant at portraying or whatever else you use, Keynote or whatever. Images and video are very powerful accompaniment to any pitch. We don't actually allow videos at the Funding Network pitches, and that's because in 6 minutes we find that video can sometimes get in the way of the presenter creating that emotional connection with the audience. So we don't allow video at our pitches, but absolutely use video where you can to tell stories, to bring things to life, and use imagery. My beef with PowerPoint is where it's used in the most lazy way, where people tend to just put a bullet pointed list of what it is they're going to say anyway up on the screen, and then somehow hope that the people in the audience are going to pay attention to what's on screen as well as what you're saying. That is a bad use of PowerPoint.
If they've asked for a pitch deck, is PowerPoint okay to use then?
Yeah, but use it as a follow-up. So there's a difference between PowerPoint as a visual aid for a presentation and PowerPoint as something that you send for people to either read if you can't present in person, or as a follow-up. So think about those two different decks in different ways. One's a deck that accompanies your pitch, and that's about high impact. The other one is a deck that, like similar to what I've been through today, which it could almost self-present. And you think about how is this PowerPoint presentation going to work if I'm not there to present? And that's not a pitch in my mind. It's a valid use of PowerPoint, but it's a different requirement.
So we've got one asking, do you think particular types of causes or projects work better than others at Funding Network presentations?
No, not really. There've been so many. Gosh, I mean, there's been over a couple of hundred different pitches from different sorts of organizations at the Funding Network. So, I mean, we have a certain criteria. So we are only focused on organizations that are sub $1 million in average annual revenue. So that's what we qualify as kind of grassroots, to give it a line. And we focus exclusively on social programs, social benefit programs. So we aren't able to fund environment or animal welfare or advocacy programs specifically. But in terms of what does better, no, I mean, I've seen great pitches from social entrepreneurs with all sorts of programs for all sorts of beneficiaries, so nothing specific.
Great. I think that's all for questions today, Tom. Was there anything you wanted to add?
Don't think so. Just go forth and be brilliant. Think about this advice today really as given humbly, and you should adapt for your own uses. I hope that some of the structure is practically useful, and I hope some of the theory was not stuff that you'd all heard before. But take it and adapt it as you see fit. I do hope that it can be of use to you in your pitches over the coming months and years.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, for presenting today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you've all learnt a lot from this presentation and that all of your questions have been answered. If you have any questions that do come to mind later on or any feedback about this webinar, please send that through to events@connectingup.org and we'll answer those questions offline. You can also contact Tom directly via the information on your screen. So don't forget the recording will be available within 2 business days and a link will be sent to you along with the slides. So keep an eye out on your inbox for that information. Again, thank you for being with us, and thank you, Tom, again for presenting. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Tina.